Good morning and welcome to the fourth meeting of committee for 2020. Can I ask that everyone switches their mobile devices off and puts them away? The first item today is a decision on taking item 5, which is consideration of budget evidence in private. Is the committee agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. Item 2 is our oral evidence session on Civil Partnership Scotland Bill at stage 1. Can I welcome the witnesses who are with us this morning? Dr. Andy Hayward, Associate Professor in Family Law, Durham Law School. Dr. Kelly Coleman, Senior Lecturer in Politics at University of Glasgow. Professor Kenneth Norrie, Professor of Law at University of Strathclyde. And Martin Lote, Chair of Equal Civil Partnerships Campaign. Morag Driscoll, Convener of Child and Family Law Committee, the Law Society of Scotland, will also be joining us shortly. And we've received apologies this morning from Professor Elaine Sutherland, who is unfortunately unwell. Good morning, you're all very welcome. Can I ask you to just spend just a couple of minutes letting committee know your knowledge and interest in civil partnerships, and if you could also tell us whether you support the principles of the bill. Dr. Kelly, I'll come to you first.
I'm a political scientist and I've studied same-sex unions for a number of years, largely in Europe and in North America as well, so Western democracies broadly defined. So I've looked quite a bit at the UK civil partnership and the Scottish civil partnership laws and in comparative perspective. So I think that was what I can offer to this committee, is to let you know kind of what other countries, other liberal democracies have done. And as I put in my, or stated my written testimony, I do support the approach being taken in this particular bill. In particular, I one, to end the discrimination, obviously, that was kind of highlighted by the UK Supreme Court decision. And I do like this option of addressing that by extending civil partnerships to mixed-sex couples or different-sex couples, largely because I think it's actually quite useful, as I said in my written testimony, to not just to address these human rights issues and discrimination issues, but also because it's actually quite helpful to pluralize family policy, to offer couples, same and different sex, more choice. I think the civil partnership does that.
Thank you. Can I come to yourself, Dr. Hayward?
Thank you. I'm a lawyer with very similar background and interests to Dr. Coleman. I look at these from a slightly different issue. I'm based in England, so my specialism there is looking at the long journey that we actually took when introducing equal civil partnerships there. I've looked at this area from a comparative perspective as well, so drawing upon different models for civil partnership reform. I support the Scottish Bill, as I supported the Equal Civil Partnerships campaign and the legislation introduced in England and Wales. The basis for doing that was twofold. I supported it from an LGBT perspective, in the sense of ensuring that same-sex couples currently in civil partnerships, not converting them, and actually choosing civil partnership when they have an option of marriage or civil partnership, should not have a relationship status of diminished validity. And I also welcome it from a equality and choice, so being able to formalise a relationship as you choose.
Yes, my name is Martin Lote. I am chair of the Equal Civil Partnership campaign south of the border. I have been involved in that campaign for 5 years, the last 2 as chair, supporting the couple Rebecca Steinfeld and Charles Keaton, who you know won the Supreme Court ruling 20 months ago or so. I of course support the bill. We have 140,000 registered supporters for our campaign. Anecdotal evidence is getting on for 400 to 500 couples have already entered into a mixed-sex civil partnership in England and Wales since they were introduced on the 31st of December. I must say, I must congratulate the Scottish Parliament on the terminology around different sex and mixed sex, because the Westminster government are still, in their documentation, still saying opposite sex civil partnerships, which doesn't allow for any gender or transitioning that may be involved. So I feel you're ahead of them there. I would like to particularly make a point that in practical terms, and I'm not an academic, I'm just a practical campaigner, the number of couples that we've seen getting involved who are in middle or later life, maybe they're divorcees or widowed or lost a partner, and the outpouring of emotion and joy on our Facebook and social media pages when they can find a valid legal union with their partner due to the law change we've seen in England and Wales has been quite moving, and I would not underestimate that kind of group. These are people in their 50s, 60s and 70s who've thought about it for a long time, know what they're doing, they're not dabbling, they've waited 20 or 30 years and now they can have a mixed-sex civil partnership, and if you can bring that in Scotland to equivalent number of couples, that would be tremendous.
Thank you. Professor Norrie.
My name's Kenneth Norrie. I have taught and researched into Scottish family law for almost 30 years now. Certainly the last 15 years, the major legal development in family law across the world has been dealing with LGBT people, and particularly for civil partnership and then the opening of marriage to mixed-sex couples, and that has been a major focus in my research for a long time. I do support this bill, but my support is possibly a little more ambivalent than my colleagues here on the bench. I need to say, first of all, that having this bill is far, far better than the current situation, which always, even before the Supreme Court told us so, it was clearly unsustainable to give mixed-sex couples more apparent choice than opposite-sex couples. So it's a good bill in the sense that it tackles that particular issue. My personal feeling is that I would have preferred it to do something else, but it isn't really doing something else. So I can live with that, and I'm perfectly happy with that. There's details that I think I would hope as the parliamentary process goes through. There are details in it, particularly in relation to gender recognition, which I think maybe need to be tweaked a little.
We'll certainly have the opportunity to explore all the detail as we go on. I'm going to bring Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Camilla. Good morning to the panel. Thank you for your introductory remarks. That was very interesting. Before I ask my substantive question, I just wonder if I can follow up with a brief supplementary on Professor Norrie's statement there. Professor Norrie, you said that you would rather this might have been something else. So I wonder, for the benefit of the committee, if you could define what that something else might have looked like.
Yeah, well, the options, on the assumption that the status quo is unacceptable, which it is, the options were either to follow the Scandinavian or Irish approach, which was to effectively wind down civil partnership, or adopt the approach which some other countries like New Zealand has taken, which is to open, and England, of course, which is to open civil partnerships to mixed-sex couples. So these were the two options. Putting it at its simplest, and this is talking purely from a legal perspective, it seems to me that it's inefficient law to have two institutions to do the job of one. And that leads me to a preference to have one institution. Personally, I don't terribly care what it's called, but I think it's efficient law reform to have one institution to which everybody can have equal access. What this bill does, and it's fine, it's much, much better, I keep emphasising it's much better than the status quo. What this bill does is we currently have two institutions. What this bill does will make these two institutions virtually indistinguishable, other than in the name and the social and emotional things that the name carries.
Do you accept that on that, Professor Norrie, that the institutions that you define, obviously the other one is marriage,
Yes.
and that for a lot of people that just the term and the concept of marriage actually carries with it a great deal of baggage and stigma even, that they would wish to avoid, but still would like to unify in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of people who care about them, that that those people would rather there were two options, because I don't think anybody in the political universe is ever going to suggest that we wind down the institution of marriage. Okay, you can plead the fifth on that, that's fine. I'll go on to my substantive question, and this is the whole panel. Can you, both from the English experience and indeed in the Scottish context, when we first created civil partnerships, it was obviously a political answer, as much as anything else, to the desire of same-sex couples to be recognised as the unions between them in law. Can you give us your reflections as to why, at the time that legislation, the original civil partnership legislation was brought in, it wasn't thought to include mixed-sex couples at the time?
Well, maybe I can answer that because having been involved in the campaign in England and Wales for a few years, literally my understanding is David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister at the time of the introduction of same-sex marriage, insisted that it was all about promoting marriage, and he rejected ideas that were put to him for full equalisation. And so the same-sex marriage Act in England and Wales went through without the fourth component, the full equalisation of mixed-sex civil partnership. So it's a bit of an analogy.
It's not really about the legislation that brought in mixed-sex marriage, but same-sex marriage, but the precursor legislation which introduced civil partnerships right out of the traps. It was only for same-sex couples. Was it considered at the time to include mixed?
I don't know for sure, but I mean, that's 2004, so that's 16 years ago, and I think that my sense is the desire for a civil partnership option for mixed-sex couples is a more recent movement. So there certainly wasn't a campaign, or there's no records we can find of anyone doing what we've been doing for the last 2 years back in 2004. So I don't know for sure, but I just don't think it was a talking point.
Yes, if I could comment on that point. There were precursor bills to the Civil Partnership Act 2004. There were two private members' bills. Lord Leicester of Herne Hill introduced one, also Jane Griffiths, MP, introduced one into the House of Commons, and they were for mixed-sex civil partnerships. It was felt at the time that it would be better to tackle the issue with same-sex couples directly because they did not have any access to any method of formalisation. And it was felt that the detriment that they suffered was greater than a need for an alternative to marriage. And so the bills did actually get some support, particularly Lord Leicester's bill, but he decided to withdraw that bill to pave the way for the 2004 bill, later the Act.
Just before we bring in the others, on that though, if there was support, and obviously this is a Westminster context we're talking about, was there not attempts during the passage of the same-sex civil partnerships legislation to amend that to include that body of support that wanted it available to mixed-sex couples?
There were attempts, and they were present in the Hansard debates, and it was raised in Parliament. But I think it was felt that this wasn't the opportunity to deal with that issue. It was felt, in particular, that the Law Commission should review cohabitation, and so focus on mixed-sex couples in that arena. It wasn't actually felt to use the civil partnership bill as a method for protecting mixed-sex couples. In a way, what we did was adopt a similar approach to the Scandinavian Nordic countries by focusing on a functional equivalent to marriage at a time when same-sex marriage wasn't politically viable.
Okay, we'll bring in Professor Norrie, and then Oliver Mundell has a supplementary.
In 2004, when the Civil Partnership Bill was going through Parliament, the major political imperative to ensure the bill's passage was to insulate it from marriage. There are various comments from, I think, Jackie Smith, who was the lead minister at Westminster at the time, that this is not about marriage. This does not attack the ancient and wonderful institution of marriage. There was a real political imperative to say, at the time, same-sex couples are different from mixed-sex couples, and that was an argument used in order to glean support for the bill at the time. 2004 was 16 years ago. The world, in particular in this area, has been transformed. So these debates, I think, today would have far less purchase, but they were really important at the time. There were attempted amendments of the bills as it was going through to widen it, but these attempts generally were from people who were opposed to the whole idea, and they were wrecking amendments so that, for example, any two people, brothers and sisters, the spinster sisters was the great thing that people looked at. Why should spinster sisters not get an inheritance tax benefit when all these gay people are being given it? That sort of argument. But these were peripheral to the main issue, which was to do something to allow same-sex couples to access all the legal rights and the legal remedies and the legal obligations and responsibilities that opposite-sex couples have had for centuries.
Thank you. Mary Fee.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. And your answer to the last question, Professor Norrie, leads me quite nicely on to my first question, which is about the differences between marriage and civil partnership, both legally and socially. And you touched on survivor benefits, because that's one of the key differences that we've heard about. And I wonder if the panel would like to expand a bit further on the differences legally and socially between the two.
To me, the major difference is not so much between the institution of marriage and the institution of civil partnership in terms of, for example, survivorship benefit. One of the problems is that neither the Civil Partnership Act nor the Marriage and Civil Partnership Scotland Act were retrospective. And what that means is that couples, same-sex couples, who did not have the opportunity to enter into one or other of these institutions, but had lived their lives as such for decades, when they marry or enter into civil partnership, the benefits that they had built up, for example, in pension contributions, were not counted. And it took a Supreme Court decision using European Union law, by the way, to say this is unlawful. So that to me is the retrospectivity is an issue. If I could give a personal example, I have been in a partnership for 31 years, but you know, if one or other of us dies, or we separate and there's a divorce issue, we'll only count 10 years of togetherness, because the law will only recognise us for 10. That to me is a much more important issue than the differences. The legal differences between marriage and civil partnership, the design has been very deliberately to make them as close as possible. And that is good. One major difference, but really who cares? The one major difference is the one major legal difference is grounds for divorce or dissolution, where for marriage, mixed sex or opposite sex, adultery is one of the grounds, but it's not one of the grounds for dissolving civil partnership. But you can get around that by other means. The other major difference, and I would much prefer this was tackled in this bill, because it makes a real effect rather than an emotional effect, is access to religious marriage. Our Act in 2014 opened religious marriages to same-sex couples. And we think we've got equal marriage, but we don't, because they've got to opt in. Each religious organisation has to opt in. And there's something like, I don't know, 25 religious bodies in Scotland who've registered with the Registrar General of Scotland as being willing to offer mixed-sex marriages. For same-sex couples, they've got a choice of about 3 Now, that's written into the 2014 legislation, but that really limits the choice that same-sex couples have as opposed to mixed-sex couples. That's the sort of thing I would much prefer was tackled rather than a good bill which allows people simply to call the relationship what they want to call it.
Okay, that's very interesting. We'll come on to talk about the issue of adultery. And my next question, the issue that you raised about retrospective rights, where, I mean, do you foresee a time in the future when that will be looked at? And would it be a standalone piece of legislation? Would there need to be lots of tweaks done to existing marriage laws to fix that?
Not marriage laws, it's in the Equality Act of 2010. It would be a simple, relatively straightforward thing to
amend that.
There's jurisdictional issues between the two parliaments, but there's no need to go into the marriage legislation or the civil partnership legislation, except the marriage and civil partnership legislation also contains that a provision that says something like this is not contrary to the Equality Act if we don't make it retrospective.
Okay, thank you.
A couple of points from the experience in England and Wales. So I think I'd depart from Professor Norrie while he's looking at the technical legal differences between civil partnership and marriage being very minimal. I'd like to put the focus more on the emotional and cultural and symbolic differences between the two institutions and the meaning that marriage has for some and civil partnership. I mean, on the point, I appreciate the Scottish legislation will be slightly different to English and Welsh, but the point about the adultery being a grounds for divorce and even a non-consummation being grounds for annulment, in both cases, effectively, you're entering into an institution where an outside party is making a comment on the sex lives of the individuals. And I believe civil partnership legislation is silent on that matter, and it's up to the couple to decide how they want to organise things. I mean, specifically, you know, for a particularly very older couple coming together for a union, you know, for them to go about that, knowing that if it's a marriage, if it wasn't consummated, it wouldn't be valid. You know, might put some people under undue pressure. The other point. We don't have consummation in Scotland. Yeah, I believe that is different. Well, we do have consummation, but it's not illegal. To some extent, yeah. But in the legislation, it's a difference. Thank you, Professor Norrie. The other point I'd like to make, which is understandably when same-sex marriage was introduced, many couples who'd been in a same-sex civil partnership, understandably, for reasons that they wanted to change that to a marriage. So they must have seen a difference to them that it was worth moving from one institution to another. If you have another group who are married but see that mixed-sex civil partnership is the choice for them, then I would argue that the emotional differences must be able to work both ways. And I don't remember people saying to same-sex couples when same-sex marriage was introduced, well, you've already got civil partnership, why do you want to get married then? And being given arguments about the legal definitions being quite similar. People understood the emotional differences. So I would argue the reverse should apply. Okay.
Dr. Hayward or Dr. Coleman, do you have any comments?
I mean, I think I would probably just kind of echo what Martin has just said there, that the symbolism and legal differences, of course, between the two institutions are not huge, either in Scotland or in England and Wales, but the symbolism matters a great deal, and indeed, as Martin just said, it matters both ways. Sometimes the symbolism of marriage obviously meant a lot for for the legitimacy of same-sex couples. On the other hand, it does come with a history, and a history I think that does still have consequences for behaviour today, and therefore it is a history that some people embrace, but others do not, and therefore the choice I think is an important one.
Dr. Hayward, would you agree, or do you have any additional
I would agree
points?
with that. The legal distinctions between civil partnership and same-sex marriage are very tiny. They're insignificant. But I think the important idea is that civil partnership act and we need to remember that formalised statuses are meant to evolve in society. The Act enables for couples the ability to imprint their values on their relationship. Yes, there are some echoes of marriage in terms of the Civil Partnership Act, but the Act can actually evolve and have its own ability to express itself, or parties express themselves through that Act. So I would agree with Martin, also Dr. Coleman, about the idea that these symbolic values can't be just sidelined. They're quite significant for the couples.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. And I'm conscious of the time, so I'll just briefly cover the issue of adultery, because a couple of our witnesses have already touched on it. Would you think that in order to have equality across all, if you call them institutions, whatever kind of institution couples want to enter into, to have true equality, adultery should be a ground for dissolution across any kind of partnership?
I would go the reverse. I completely agree with Martin when he said the law should not be getting involved in looking at people's sex lives. I would remove adultery. Okay. I would remove any interest that our legislation has in the sex life, in the sex lives of adults who are trying to enter into personal relationships.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Dr. Hayward.
I agree. I think what should happen is adultery should not be there for marriage or civil partnership. But as an interim measure, what I would recommend would be for civil partnerships to not have adultery at all, both for mixed sex and same sex, and to consider down the line, and some of the responses touch on this, an overhaul of divorce law. We've got a bill currently before the House of Lords, the Divorce, Dissolution and Separation Bill, that would remove fault completely from our divorce law and get rid of adultery completely. It would simply be a statement of marital breakdown subject to a time period. And I think that's a much more progressive, modern approach.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
From Adele.
Thank you, Convener. I just wanted to come back to Professor Norrie and the question of legal efficiency, and I was just going to push it just slightly further and just ask whether or not there's an element where the law does have to take into account the kind of social and emotional feelings of the people it's meant to govern, and whether that's a different form of efficiency.
Don't get me wrong. The law does have a symbolic role to play. And I think a really good example of that is the Marriage and Civil Partnership Scotland Act of 2014, which in reality gave to same-sex couples very, very little that they did not already have under the Civil Partnership Act, in terms of legal consequence, in terms of the party that you have to create the relationship, and involving ministers and all that sort of thing. That's different. But in terms of actual legal consequences, it did virtually, not quite nothing, but virtually nothing. But that wasn't the point of that Act. The point of that Act was symbolism, to declare very, very clearly that 2,000 years of discrimination against LGBT people, official disparagement of LGBT people, a status-based assumption in the law, all of that was over. And I think that was a very, very powerful and important piece of legislation that the Scottish Parliament enacted. There is symbolism in this, but to me, personally, it doesn't have the same purchase. Of course, some people reject marriage because it has a patriarchal religious history. Of course, that is true. But that, I mean, to me, it's a bit like saying, it's a bit like a woman saying, I'm not going to vote because previously the voting rules were patriarchal and the voting rules were designed to keep men in power and women out of power. We've moved on. The world has moved on. Marriage has evolved into... I dislike the phrase equal marriage, which was the big, powerful slogan which was around, and it served its purpose. I much prefer gender-neutral marriage. I think the 2014 Act has created gender-neutral marriage. So marriage, to me, has been saved, effectively, as an institution that is open to everybody after the 2014 bill. And because of that, I see this bill as less powerful, far less powerful than the 2014 bill. But nevertheless, it does have symbolic and emotional purchase for some people. I do acknowledge that.
And that would be, you know, from a legal point of view, a legitimate kind of policy reason for doing something.
Yes.
That's what I wanted to clarify, really,
Yes.
for balance.
Oliver, just before you go on, Dr. Coleman.
2 quick points.
Yeah.
I agree a lot with what Professor Norris just said in terms of the symbolism and perhaps opening marriage was a more symbolic punch, basically. But I don't know that I agree completely with the analogy with voting for women. I think that history of where women were excluded for voting doesn't necessarily impact on their behavior today when they go and think about voting or participating in politics, basically. I think that history of marriage, and of course has evolved a lot, and I'm not trying to actually say anything against marriages today, but I think it does still have an impact on how people behave today, and I think that's a big difference. And therefore, the reason why the symbolism here, I think, is actually important.
No, thank you. I was then going to move on just to ask if you have any concerns about sort of interim plans to recognise different sex civil partnerships in the rest of the UK in Scotland.
As far as I read from the bill, the interim plans are that if different sex civil partnerships come into force in the rest of the UK before they do in Scotland, these will be treated in Scotland as marriages until such time as our bill becomes effective. I see no conceptual difficulty with that whatsoever. Our legislatures were perfectly comfortable for 10 years between 2004 and 2014 in telling same-sex couples who married abroad that when they came to this country, they were in civil partnerships and they would be treated as such. A lot of people didn't like that, but the law managed that and accommodated, and it was a mechanism, a clumsy and unfortunate mechanism, but it was a mechanism to allow the legal rights and responsibilities to flow. That's what these interim measures are doing here. So it's simply following a pattern.
I'd have to come in there, speaking not just in my role as in the Equal Civil Partnerships campaign, but personally being somebody who's in a mixed-sex civil partnership recognised in England and Wales, to go through everything we've been through on a campaigning level and read that in the interim period, the relationship I'm in would be treated as a marriage if I was to move or operate in Scotland, as I understand it. I'm actually personally in that target group. I would have a huge problem in principle with that. That would just undercut what I've been campaigning for 5 years, to the point that I might not want to come to Scotland until that position was removed. I haven't gone through all this to be treated as I'm married for a technical expediency. It's not for me to tell you how to run your laws, but I would urge you to either rethink that or move very, very quickly through the process so that it becomes a purely theoretical point. But it sticks in the throat to see that the relationship I'm in will be treated as marriage when I'm a campaigner for mixed-sex civil partnerships.
Thank you. And I guess following on from that, is there not a sort of similar concern about how civil partnerships, and I know it's an issue for some people already, but how they're seen and recognised overseas, you know, in both mixed and you know, both forms of civil partnership, if you like, how they are seen by other jurisdictions and what rights extend.
It's an inevitable problem that if the Scottish Parliament creates or expands an institution, the Scottish Parliament has no power to tell the rest of the world to recognise that institution. But I don't think we should be hung up about that. We have to do what is right for Scotland and for people in Scotland, people who live in Scotland and people who come to Scotland. We have to do what's right. We can't influence Iran or Iraq or any country or Saudi Arabia that is not going to recognise our relationships. There's half the countries in the world. I have sympathy for Martin if he comes to Scotland and feels his relationship isn't properly recognised. Half the countries in the world, if I go to, I would be regarded not just as in a legally recognised relationship that is called something that I don't want it to be called, it wouldn't be recognised at all. I would effectively be divorced every time I got off an aeroplane in some countries. I have been told by immigration officers in some countries some years ago that I'm no longer in a relationship because I've simply crossed the border. But the Scottish, no parliament on this planet can tell every other country what to do. That's just an inevitable consequence of different legal systems having different problems. The issue is the reverse one. What do you do when people come to Scotland? That's the important one. And I mean, again, I have sympathy for Martin, and I understand the issue because, in a sense, I faced it too. Though, frankly, in a more severe form, it would not be technically problematical for this bill to be amended to say mixed-sex relationships validly created abroad will be recognised here, even although you can't enter into one here yet. And the analogy that I would draw would be with polygamous marriages. You cannot enter into a polygamous marriage in this country. However, if you validly enter into a polygamous marriage in a country that allows that, with parties who are domiciled there and national of that country, and they come here, they will still be married. So I would have I see no technical problem in this bill being amended in the way that Martin wants. And actually, I would clearly support such an amendment.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Angela, were you wanting to?
Yes, thank you, Convener. Good morning to the panel. I would be really keen if we could distill the benefits surrounding different sex partnerships. And I know the panel at various points this morning have touched upon the benefits, in terms of more societal aspects, the social emotional aspects that Oliver Mundell spoke of. And I know in answer to Mary Fee's questions, we were touched upon, some of the more practical benefits around pension rights. But I wonder if, in thinking about the benefits of having different sex partnerships, if we could focus on the rights that would give people, in particular, I suppose the different rights that people have in comparison to if they were cohabiting. Because even in Scotland, where there are enhanced rights, if you are cohabiting for a lengthy period of time, it's still not the same as marriage.
Well, I'll come in, but I will leave it to the family law sort of academics on the detail. But yes, I mean, we faced in England and Wales a challenge to try and educate people that there's no such thing as a common law marriage, and that I think many couples that are cohabiting still do, but maybe it's reducing now, kind of thought they had rights, and in practical terms often maybe more affects the woman in the relationship if the man works, accrues some wealth and then leaves, and the woman thinks she's going to get equal shares, and that might not be the case. And so we have argued that the civil partnership for mixed-sex couples provides a lighter, easier way to get their legal recognition protection that would apply to both sides of the couple in that example and protect the children. So I will leave it to others to put the fine detail, but for our point of view of the campaign, a mixed-sex civil partnership is a easy, doable way to get equal rights. I think it costs £46.
Okay, thank you.
In terms of the English perspective on that, I think the legal benefits, we've touched on some of them, but it's also the idea that this is a status. There's formalisation, we have a start date, potentially an end date, that will generate an ability to calculate and accrue benefits. We have the standard benefits in terms of protection upon relationship breakdown, which is a really important one. And I note in particular that Scotland has Section 28 of the Family Law Scotland Act 2006 that allows for a cohabitation claim, which I know the Scottish Law Commission is reviewing at the moment, but we don't have that at all in England. And so, in a way, whilst I welcome cohabitation reform in England and Wales, and I think this is the next area for us to go into, I think the fact that you have that is quite important, but it does need reform. So I think in terms of protecting vulnerable couples, I think civil partnerships will be certainly attractive. I think in England and Wales they will be popular. We'll probably have a surge in demand, but it will not remove the pressing need for a broader blanket safety net for all couples.
Okay, thank you. Professor Norrie?
Andy is quite right that it doesn't tackle the real issue in England. There's an argument to say that opening civil partnership to mixed-sex couples is more urgent in England and Wales than it is in Scotland because they don't have cohabitation provisions in the way that we do here. We have succession claims, we have claims on separation, we have financial adjustment to these difficult periods of people's lives. The real issue in terms of choice is between registered relationships, whether marriage and civil partnership, and unregistered relationships. Now, one of the real problems in England is that the Parliament there has consistently refused to deal with the issue of unregistered relationships. So if you don't register, in whichever institution, if you don't register, you're left in an extremely vulnerable position. And Martin's quite right. All the statistics, all the research shows that people believe that they have this so-called common law marriage, but they don't, they have nothing. In Scotland, it's quite different. So people already have a choice of whether to register the relationship and get the full gamut of rights and responsibilities or not register relationships, in which case the law will protect the vulnerable. This bill is all about registered relationships, and it doesn't address and isn't the place to address any further amendments in relation to cohabiting unregistered couples.
But is it the case, Professor Norrie, that in Scotland that there are some enhanced rights if you're in a civil partnership or a marriage in comparison to cohabiting in Scotland? And, you know, am I right in thinking that that's around some issues around pensions, some issues around exclusion orders of perpetrators of domestic violence, and, you know, there are perhaps other quite discrete nuances?
You're right, except in relation to the domestic violence legislation, which is very carefully designed to cover all types of couples. But your fundamental point is absolutely right. If you're in a registered relationship, you get enhanced protections. The cohabitant provisions give you very deliberately, this Parliament chose in 2006 deliberately to keep the protections lesser for cohabiting couples in order not to undermine, so the argument went at the time, in order not to undermine the institution of marriage. So there is a hierarchy of marriage oblique civil partnership at the top, then cohabitants, and then people who perhaps don't live together but are in long-term relationships.
Okay,
so there is a hierarchy, yes.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Dr. Coleman?
Just, obviously I won't talk to the details of the different laws because that's what the family lawyers here can do. But just to say that in terms of policy needs, I mean, I think that it's very clear that that family types are continuously diversifying. That cohabitants in particular are becoming a much more common family type, and I think it is. And the cohabitants law here obviously is very, very helpful. But I think, as Andy said already, the Law Commission is looking into whether it's actually adequate, given that quite a bit has changed in how people actually live their lives and form families since 2006. I think it's very much worth looking at to see if that cohabitants law is really doing the job that we need it to do, given society as it is today.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to return to the issue of gender recognition because, Professor Norrie, you touched on it in an earlier response. And in your submission, you questioned whether the full implications have been worked out when one party to an existing civil partnership or marriage changes gender. I wonder if you could expand on your comments and explain what the difficulties you see are, and then I could perhaps come to the rest of the panel for their views.
The practical difficulty is that there are two bills before the Scottish Parliament at the moment. There's the Civil Partnership Scotland Bill, which we have before us today, and there's the Gender Recognition Amendment Bill, which might just be a draft, I can't remember, or has it been? So you've got, now this is a repeat of what happened in 2004, when you had the Civil Partnership Act bill going through Westminster, followed very quickly thereafter by the Gender Recognition Act of 2004, and the interplay became very, very clumsy. And we're facing the same clumsiness. The Scottish Parliament is facing the same clumsiness this year, which is, I think, really unfortunate. And if you could combine them both together, I think a lot of the problems would be resolved. The main problem is it's overly complex. It seems to me that once marriage...
Is it overly complex because of necessity of law, or is it overly complex because we have made it overly complex?
We have made it overly complex, but it was designed to deal with the fact that in 2004 there was a complete separation of same-sex relationships and mixed-sex relationships, civil partnerships and marriage. So if one of the parties in either changed gender, that relationship had to come to an end because we couldn't accommodate a different gender mix in either of the relationships. When the marriage legislation came through, it sort of half dealt with the problem, because with marriage, it now doesn't matter. This is why I prefer the term gender neutral. What this bill does, and it is good, is to make civil partnership gender neutral. Now, given that both relationships are gender neutral, if that is the point where we had started, the transgender issue simply wouldn't arise because it wouldn't matter. Instead of which, we're trying to replicate the complex provisions of interim gender recognition certificates while you're in a relationship in order to protect the other party. Well, frankly, we don't need all of that. If a person in a relationship changes gender and the other person cannot accept that or accommodate that or no longer wishes to be in a relationship, we've got the divorce courts to deal with that. It seems to me not to be a difficult thing, but instead we're trying to replicate the sensitivities which we created in a different world to deal with a different situation in 2004.
Okay. And what were the rest of the panel's view on that?
I broadly agree with Professor Norrie. I will pass on this one. I have another point to make in a minute, so I'll save time.
I'm also broadly in agreement.
Just to give an English perspective, the Part 5 of the Civil Partnership Opposite Sex Couples Regulations 2019, these were the regs that brought in mixed-sex civil partnerships in England and Wales, have then allowed an individual with a full gender recognition certificate to be able to have that without dissolving the CP, provided the partner consents. So there is an alignment there, so that there is no break of that relationship. You can switch between the different types of status, and I think that is a welcome thing, but we are also consulting on this issue, and we're going to change, hopefully down the line, but I don't know when, the Gender Recognition Act through our own consultation, but that has been stalled.
Okay.
So it might be premature to make any movement yet.
If I could come back to Professor Norrie then, because the gender recognition bill is out for consultation. There is a draft bill. So are you suggesting that the place to remedy this is through that piece of legislation? And if an amendment was made to that piece of legislation when it comes here, does something need to be done to this piece of legislation to mirror so the two of them are the same, or is the gender recognition the only legislation that needs changed?
I don't know is the short answer to that. All I said in my written submission is I think you need to look at this carefully. Probably the clean, sensible place to deal with it would be in the gender recognition bill, in which case the provisions in this bill amending the Gender Recognition Act of 2004 maybe need to be looked at again.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Annie.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I've just got some further questions to ask. What are your views on allowing married couples to convert their marriage to a civil partnership and vice versa, if I could get your panel's views?
I did very much want to come in on that point. I think the Westminster government have got themselves in a few knots on that one, and this is specifically on the conversion of a mixed-sex or traditional marriage to a mixed-sex civil partnership. That is still under consultation in England and Wales, and was at the last minute sort of kicked out of the bill that we had down there because it was seen as a bit more controversial, maybe issuing in rejections from the church and other religious groups. So, I would think there's an opportunity in Scotland to sort of neaten things up and get it all clarified. There is an argument that couples who find themselves in traditional marriages and suddenly realise that, in fact, they would have had a mixed-sex civil partnership had been available, should be able to convert. I totally agree with that. The Equal Civil Partnerships campaign position is we totally agree with that. What we don't want is there to be any time limit on it. We don't want people to have 2 years, 18 months that they've got to make their decision. There's two main reasons for that. One is there's a very practical one. There may be a couple just living, working overseas in a jurisdiction that doesn't recognise mixed-sex civil partnerships, so they have had to be married, and then they move back here or to Scotland or England and Wales 5 years' time and find that the ship has sailed on the conversion opportunity. But the other one is more of a sort of social and societal one, which is where we feel that we're on the verge of there's a new social construct here in mixed-sex civil partnerships, and who knows how it's going to mature or develop. But my view is it's silently building, and it's going to get bigger and bigger and more popular. And 5, 10, 15 years from now could be the norm for many people when they see others in their peer group joining in with mixed-sex civil partnerships. And if a couple that are married and decide 5 or 10 years from now that actually they understand the differences and they would rather be in a civil partnership and they want to convert, I wouldn't want them, and the Equal Civil Partnership campaign wouldn't want that to be not allowed. To me, it would be like saying that we're making provisions for, say, something like veganism 20 years ago, but as long as you declare that you're a vegan, now you can be one forevermore, and then we know how society changes and suddenly something becomes more popular and other people want to join in. So we would argue for an open-ended ability to convert from a traditional marriage to a mixed-sex civil partnership.
Anyone else got anything on that? Yes, Professor.
Sorry, I just broadly agree. I think, I mean, part of this is about increasing choice for people and how they want to structure their lives. And I think leaving that open as long as you can, or making that as liberal as you can, I think, and choice is a good thing. And just to kind of echo what Martin was saying, using examples from other countries, so the PACS, which is a registered partnership light type thing in France, has become increasingly more important or popular. So that now for every 5 marriages, there's 4 PACS in France, and that's something that has changed increasingly over the years. And even the registered partnership in the Netherlands, which was open to both mixed and same-sex couples, was never all that popular for a variety of reasons, but has become actually increasingly more popular in the Netherlands. So I think things are changing, and I think the direction of travel in other European countries is that registered partnerships have become more popular for mixed-sex couples as well.
There's a fundamental flaw in this bill which will come back to haunt you. The idea is to do for mixed-sex couples what we previously did for same-sex couples. Fine. What we did for same-sex couples when marriage came in was to give couples who were already in a civil partnership the choice of either to stay in that civil partnership or to convert to a marriage. And you could convert by 2 mechanisms, by purely administrative mechanism or by getting married, which I don't think is available in England. You can effectively, the point is you can convert. If you're in a same-sex civil partnership, you can convert to marriage. I think for the first year, all fees were waived on the ground that these are people who had only one option at the time. Now they've got 2 options. They want to take the second option. They shouldn't have to pay for that. That's the model that should have been adopted here. So that, I think reading the policy document, the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government had deliberately chosen not to allow people in marriages to convert to civil partnerships, presumably for the fear of undermining marriage and all that sort of thing. But they should have, if the whole point of this is to do for opposite-sex couples what has previously done for same-sex couples, then do it all. Allow the opportunity for people who, for mixed-sex couples who married, but now think we would have preferred in the other. Allow them to do that, and for the first year, don't charge them from doing that for doing that. Just follow the model that we adopted successfully in 2014.
Do you know, I think that's probably answered all my questions from the answers that you gave me, so thank you very much, and thanks, Convener.
Oliver, if your supplementary's brief, we can...
I was going to say, I think Professor Norrie's probably captured the point I was going to push on.
Okay, well, that brings our session to an end. Thank you very much for your evidence this morning. That's been very helpful, and we'll suspend briefly to change our panels. Welcome back. Our third item of business is an oral evidence session on the 2020-21 budget with the Minister for Older People and Equalities. Good morning, Minister. You're very welcome. So we have Christina McKelvey, who is Minister for Older People and Equalities, Sean Stronach, who's Joint Head of the Equality Unit, and Emma Harvey, the Equality Unit Performance Manager from the Scottish Government. Thanks for being with us this morning. Minister, can I invite you to make opening remarks of up to 5 minutes, please?
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you again for your invitation to appear before the committee to look at the scrutiny of the budget process or 2021 draft budget. I'm looking forward to addressing the committee's questions this morning because I'm sure you have many and they'll be varied, but specifically on my own portfolio budget. A budget which has seen the largest single increase in the equalities line, taking it to its highest ever level of £30.2 million, demonstrating, I think, and I hope you will think as well, this government's commitment to delivering equality and human rights for the people of Scotland. My 2021 budget will continue to promote equality and human rights through investment in organisations working to achieve equality for women and girls, including the important work of preventing gender-based violence. It will remove barriers to positive ageing and strengthen community engagement. This budget also supports the cross-cutting work to deliver on the recommendations of the two major reports we've seen from the National Advisory Council on Women and Girls, and supports the very ambitious National Task Force on Human Rights Leadership. Both of these important groups are providing leadership and challenge to the government and society, and we must be in a position to respond positively, to listen and to make better policy that improves the lives of people across Scotland, which I think is something we all agree with. It is my aim to ensure that we continue to firmly embed equality and human rights across the whole of the Scottish Government. And as you are aware, there's a whole range of activity across Government that supports the mainstreaming of equality and human rights. The Equality and Fairer Scotland budget statement is now an integral part, a very welcome integral part of the Scottish Government's budget process, something I agitated for from that side of the table, as you will realise. This year, we have integrated the Fairer Scotland assessment into the equality budget statement, with each portfolio chapter examine the impact of budget decisions on people and places experiencing socio-economic disadvantage. It responds to our legal duties to assess the equality and Fairer Scotland impacts of our tax and spending decisions too. We are also going further within government. That is why the First Minister, responding to a recommendation made by her Advisory Council for Women and Girls last month, announced the establishment of a new Directorate of Equality, Inclusion and Human Rights within the Scottish Government. The new Directorate will help to raise the status of equalities and human rights right across all the work that we do, and it will help ensure that we have a greater capacity to embed a greater regard for equality and human rights right across all areas of government, from the very beginning to the very end. I welcome that the committee has chosen to look at equality and human rights through the lens of the third sector and in its pre-budget scrutiny. The third sector is a very key partner in all of the work that I do. To increase equality, to see a fairer Scotland, it is absolutely essential that we work together across national and local government with the public sector and alongside our very valued third sector and private sectors too. This need for partnership work in ensuring that we are all driving forward the same targets for reducing inequalities is what has driven the decision to increase the budget. And that's in line with your recommendation to convener, and what we will continue to be our guiding principle as we make the decisions on how the budget will be deployed. So we're looking at how do we spend the money, how do we do that. The majority of my budget line supports the third sector equality infrastructure and builds capacity of organisations supporting equality and human rights. There's such a varied amount of them across every protected characteristic. I note that the committee welcomed our move to 3-year funding in 2017, and I remain absolutely committed to that principle. The main equalities funding streams can broadly be split into two versions. So there's one that supports the violence against women and girls sectors, and those which support the broader equality and human rights sector too. The funding under those streams comes to an end this summer, so we've been working very hard to look at how we can organise that funding much more effectively, and I will shortly be announcing the details of what will follow, but I am pleased to confirm that we are in agreement with the committee about the principles of that funding. And there's three main parts to that. And that it should be, it should provide a multi-year funding. So that's something that will continue, absolutely. Ensure sufficient time and support for the application process, because I think that's absolutely key. And it's also key to the third aspect of this, which is support partnership working and fair work principles. There's an ability now to do much more partnership working across, public bodies in the third sector and other bodies as well. And given the right support in order to do that, we'll be absolutely keen making sure we get that right too. So your scrutiny for me has raised very important questions about how the budget decisions are driven by the National Performance Framework as well. As you will know, the NPF is not just the Scottish Government's framework, it's Scotland's framework, and ties very closely into our responsibilities around UN treaties and the SDGs as well. It sets us all the challenge of working together to create a more successful country with opportunities for all of Scotland to flourish through increased well-being and sustainable and inclusive economic growth. It means we're putting equality and human rights at the heart of our policy making and delivery. Because it's not just about making the policy, it's about creating the outcomes. As we develop our future funding criteria, I'm very clear about the need to ensure that that links absolutely clearly with the National Performance Framework. Without a commitment to equality and human rights across government, we cannot achieve our NPF outcomes or ensure that we are living those values which it articulates. And it says in it, we are a society which treats all of our people with kindness, dignity and compassion. So I thank the committee for giving me an open statement, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Minister. We'll go straight to questions. Alex Gold.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister, and good morning to your officials. I think it's fair to say the committee is recognising of the 21% real terms increase in the Equalities budget, and that is very welcome. To loosely use some of the government's own 6 key questions to ask when making a budget decision, which was published last year, perhaps the Minister can answer some of those questions herself. And I'd start with how your budget decision will impact in a granular detail on individuals in our society.
Yeah, there's lots of areas. You'll know that the framework of the work that I am doing in government around about equalities is looking at the protected characteristics across the Equality Act and a bit wider as well. So when I'm making decisions, any decisions that I make, I've always got a human face that I'm looking at as to who would this have an impact on, or which group would that have an impact on, or where can we make the difference of that. So that question is always asked at the beginning of any decision-making process that I start. So there's lots of examples of that. The work we're doing in Equally Safe and violence against women, for instance, the work we're doing with the LGBTI community, the gender inequality work that we're tackling, the issue around about ageism when it comes to older people, the work that we're doing around about social isolation and loneliness, and the work obviously that we have done and you have helped me with on the Gypsy Traveller Action Plan. So when I make any decisions, that's what I see in my head as those real people who would be affected by those decisions. But the overarching focus of the budget is obviously in line with the National Performance Framework, that we do respect, protect, fulfil human rights and live free from discrimination. It's a very lofty aim, but I think it's a noble aim, and it's an aim I think that we all agree that is incredibly important. So unless I'm seeing those human faces when I'm making those decisions, then it really wouldn't be that outcome wouldn't be what we want to see. So I see all of that. Our approach to equality and human rights is to see it embedded right across the whole of government. So one of the very welcome developments in the additional money that I've now got in the budget is we have formulated a mainstreaming team led by Jenny Kemp, who many of you will know from her work with Zero Tolerance and others. We've all crossed paths, and she's now looking at how do we use public sector equality duty much more effectively, and how do we mainstream with her team right across the whole of government. So all of those decisions that are being made in government right now have to have that human face on it and have to be seen through that lens of the our commitment to ending inequality and ending discrimination as well. In terms of how it would impact and how it would be evaluated, all of the funding streams that I'm looking at right now and how we can realign them for the new funding streams coming up and how that announcement will be made very, very soon, is much more closely aligned to the National Performance Framework indicators so that we can measure the outcomes as well. So I'm not just seeing the human, which is much more important to me actually, is the human outcomes and the advances we make for people there. But we actually see, in that granular form, in that data form, where we're actually making progress as well.
Thank you for that, Minister. You've actually swept up one of my subsequent questions as well. But I'll finish with this then, and I welcome that answer, very, very comprehensive answer you've just given. There's an obvious disconnect that exists in terms of realising human rights in our society, because the Scottish Government can put money behind it, it can put policy behind it, but ultimately the deliverers of human rights are more often than not in our communities, in our local authorities, and we have, rightly, a restricted ability to compel local authorities to act in a certain way. How will you make sure that this enhanced investment will make human rights real at a local level and do that in a spirit of partnership with our local authority colleagues?
So one of the things I've been looking at in the point I made in my open remarks about much more ability to have partnership working, I think there's always been the ability to do that within government, but the drive, you know, is maybe, and the opportunities haven't been there before. So part of the process of organisations applying for the new funding when it comes along is given some of that freedom. So you'll have the three-year awards, which will allow you some protection and sustainability for the work that you're doing, and a bit of confidence as well that you're funded for the next 3 years. But within that as well is that ability to do that partnership working. Some of that is with COSLA and the work that we currently do with COSLA, and we I spend a lot of time working with my COSLA counterparts, Councillor Elena Whittam and Councillor Kelly Parry, on a number of areas where they joint co-chair many of the much of the work that we're doing. So Kelly Parry co-chairs in the Equally Safe Joint Strategic Board along with me. She also co-chairs the Implementation Group for Social Isolation and Loneliness. Elena Whittam's been an absolute key partner in working with the Gypsy Traveller Action Plan and the continued actions and scrutiny of that work as well. But what this budget has allowed me to do is to focus some hard cash and quite serious money into some additional posts in COSLA in order to realise all of these outcomes. So you'll know in the Gypsy Traveller Action Plan I built in a 6-month report back scheme in order to make sure that we are making progress there. In order for that work to happen, we need to have someone that's dedicated to doing that work. So we funded a post in COSLA to do that scrutiny work, and it's the same across the board. We've got posts that are funded via our Violence Against Women and Girls and Equally Safe work as well, so that we are doing that very, very close work, because you're absolutely right. For a lot of people, the delivery mechanism, where they will go to seek support will be local authorities, but it will also be local authorities working in partnership with other organisations. So for instance, some of the work that we're doing on the FGM bill right now, you know, requires a lot of specialist work. So working with organisations like the Multicultural Family Centre down in Leith or Sahelia or some of the other organisations that do that type of support. For some of the work that we do and the people that we are hoping to support, it's quite specialised. It's very, you know, it needs a lot of sensitivity. So unless I do that partnership working across the board with all of those partners, whether it be in public authorities or in the third sector or wider communities, that's incredibly important, because those decisions, as you said, taking back to your question, have to be made locally, but they have to be not just made locally, but influenced locally as well. So having that very, very clear link to those organisations and taking that work forward. An example is the Implementation Group for Social Isolation and Loneliness. I have asked the stakeholders to fill that group and tell me what we should spend that money on, and they're coming back with some absolutely amazing and innovative ideas to do that. So it's a bit about government giving away some of its power to local people and local organisations, saying, let's see how can we really home in and target in on where we need to make a difference here. And that's where that local partnership is incredibly important.
Thank you.
Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Convener. I mean, obviously, it's good to see some budgets go up and budget lines go up, but there are also some which go down. And I just wondered whether the Minister was concerned about the reduction to the third sector budget line, given particularly that this committee had recommended for it to increase.
Yeah, I think the third sector, so that's a very specific line that affects Miss Campbell's portfolio, and I'm sure that I can alert her to come back to you on some of the specifics on that. But you'll know that the third sector is funded from right across the whole of government, and there's I mean, I couldn't answer for every other minister and cabinet secretary in here for where they've got that commitment, but there is, right across the whole of government, that very clear commitment to the third sector as well. But the very specific point you make, because I think there's some detail that's needed behind that decision that I can maybe get Ms Campbell to respond to you on the specifics of that.
I think that would be helpful, because I recognise, and I hope you would, and I think from the comments you made at the start, is recognising how integral the third sector is at delivering human rights. And again, I'd also highlight the role local authorities play. I know the budgets for them are very tight, and certainly my own local authority is raising concerns about its ability to fund a number of services that support vulnerable people in our communities. So obviously it's good in sort of headline terms to see the specific equalities budget go up, but I just worry that there's a potential for equalities to kind of be the first thing that people want to cut sort of in other budgets, and sometimes it's the most vulnerable people that are forgotten. Is that something you're pushing, right across the government ahead of the budget?
It's something I'm very mindful of as well, in response to your colleague Alec Cole-Hamilton's question as well, around about how do we mainstream across government if we don't have those principles attached to everything that we do. And that's where a big piece of the work of the Equality Unit and the mainstreaming team are taking up that work. You're absolutely right. One of the guiding principles for me around about the partnership working ability that we've now built into funding streams is about doing some of that work to address some of the challenges in everybody's budget. It's very welcome for me to have an uplift in my budget. It's very, I think, unusual. There'll be some envy about the fact there's an uplift in my budget, but there's a much more we've been asked to deliver in that sense, and there's much more that we're asking our partners to deliver as well. So one of the key elements of allowing that funding to be a partnership approach was to try and address some of those local issues. Everybody's budget's pressured, and we should all recognise that, to do some of that local partnership work. Absolutely key, and that's why funding some of the posts in COSLA has allowed us to do some of that as well. Instead of adding additional pressure onto our colleagues in COSLA and the wider local government area, we're hoping to support some of that with the work in partnership.
Yeah, and I just wanted to raise a specific concern that we've heard from the third sector about social care, and it being particularly vulnerable when it comes to local government budget pressures. And again, whether that's something that you've had any involvement in, or if there's more that the Scottish Government as a whole can do to make sure that kind of vital sector is well supported.
And I've heard some of those concerns myself, and I heard many of them yesterday in relation to the new immigration system as well, and the impact that will have. Donald McCaskill had a lot to say about that yesterday, and I think quite rightly so, to have social care workers described as low skilled. I spent the last 6 years before I came to this place training social care workers. They are not low skilled people, and that's pretty bad, on top of the pressures that people already have on their budgets. To then have your professionalism described as low skilled is really not acceptable. But the social care work is obviously held by my colleague Jean Freeman and her portfolio, and again I'm happy to make sure that she can come back to you with some of the specifics on what's currently being spent, because there is a massive spend. I spent some time with the social health and social care partnership in my own area on Monday night at a community council meeting, and they were very positive in the work that they are doing there, because having that partnership with health and social care has really made a huge difference. The total resource spending for health at the health and sport portfolio is now £14.8 billion. That's a huge amount of money, with a huge demand on that money as well. So I'm certainly happy to ask Ms Freeman to go into some of the detail of that, if that helps you.
Yeah, the points about yesterday aside, I mean, I think these issues are long-standing, and certainly, making political points about immigration won't help the existing workforce and providers in my area who do feel undervalued, not in terms of how their jobs describe, but in terms of how much they actually get paid for it, and the huge pressure they're under, often driving, spending most of the day driving between visits for which they don't currently get properly paid.
But
So
remember,
I mean, there's a lot of pre-existing issues, and I think that you can't. There are legitimate questions around immigration and the future of that, but it doesn't get away from the fundamental issues that there have been for a long time in the social care sector in Scotland. And I just wouldn't want that to get lost.
Yeah, and remember, social care workers in Scotland get paid the living wage as well, which is a very different prospect from other parts of the UK. So there is a value placed on the work that they do. Is it enough? Maybe not, but absolutely we value our social care workers, and we can't get away from the points that other decisions made elsewhere would have an impact on their ability to do their job, or even how they're valued in doing their job. So it's up to us to make sure that we do value how they do their job. And as a former social care worker trainer, there will never be a circumstance where I'll ever describe a social care worker as low-skilled.
Okay, well, we'll move on for now, and I want to ask specifically in terms of social care and given how I certainly see it being treated as a poor relation when it comes to healthcare and local authority decisions, whether or not any further thoughts being given to looking at voting rights for the third sector on integrated joint boards, and whether that would make sure the sector was more respected.
Obviously, again, how integrated joint boards and the decisions that they take and how they work is a question again for the Cabinet Secretary, and I'm happy to make sure that she comes back to you with this. One of the challenges I've got in my portfolio is I have a cross-cutting job to do around about equalities and human rights and older people, but I don't have the delivery of some of the actual services in that, and it would be a massive job if I did. So my job is to try and influence that we take decisions that are based on equalities and human rights, paying people better, having the carers, oh God, what is it called? The carers positive scheme. All of those things where actually it makes people feel valued at their work, but also makes them feel as if they are doing a good job as well, which is incredibly important. But
Recognise, personally, that from the work this committee has done, that there is a legitimate point that if the third sector don't have a vote on decisions that have been taken at integrated joint boards, then they're going to have less of a say, and be treated in a different way to other partners, and that doesn't really fully respect the role that they play.
Well, I'm not sure of the detail of that, so I'll have to get back to you. I'll get Ms Freeman to come back to you for the detail on that specific question. I think I would be pulling things at the back of my head, which was maybe not appropriate for this committee, but certainly I can get you the detailed information for that.
So you didn't look at that when it was in our report that's been published?
Well, there's areas of your report that are just not for my budget area. My budget area is obviously a quality human rights budget. It's not about how social care is delivered.
Pardon me, I'll interrupt briefly. We do have a response from the Scottish Government on that point, so we can recirculate that. Yeah. Fulton, you had a supplementary. Was it?
It goes back actually to the earlier discussion between the Minister and Oliver and Dale about immigration. I'm really glad you brought that up, and I know that.
About immigration rather than about the budget. I might bring in colleagues that have, because I'm conscious we're quite short of time today. Is it specifically about?
It was specifically about the budget, yeah.
Okay.
So I'm glad that it was raised. I will be very brief, convener. I'm glad that it was raised because I find it quite frightening. I think it does have a massive impact on the budget scrutiny and the budget. Now, obviously, the decision or the announcement was just made yesterday. But do you know, whether it's your department or another department, of any analysis that's been done yet on the Scottish Government, on the consequences to the Scottish Government budget that this policy might have?
So there's my honest answer is I'm not sure, and I'll find out for you. My gut reaction is, given that the Minister for Migration, Ben McPherson, was on the telly yesterday saying, I only found out about this via a news release, and there was no discussion or contribution asked for from the Scottish Government on the impact of it, and the fact that the Scottish Government had produced their own visa scheme proposal, and the economic impact of that has got an analysis attached to that. So that's worth looking at it as far as budgets go now. But there was, as far as I'm aware, Mr McPherson had no contact from the UK Government other than seeing the press release when it went out.
Okay, I want to bring us back to our job today. We're half an hour left, and we've got the budget to scrutinise. Mary, can I bring you in?
Convener, and good morning to the panel. I want to come back to the issue of funding cycles, because the move from 1 to 3 year funding is very welcome. And in a previous answer, you said, Minister, that it would bring protection and sustainability. And I absolutely agree with that. But I wonder, just to put a bit more kind of flesh on the bones of it, if you can give us some practical examples of the difference the move in the funding cycle has made to third sector organisations.
Apart from having some proper security, I formerly used to run an ESF social work funded project myself, and we had to issue 90-day notices every year, because you didn't know if your funding was coming to an end. So you actually were only working for about 10 months of the year, and the next 2 months was about preparing for whether you were getting your funding or not. It's 45-day notices now, but it's just as unpalatable as it would be then. So and to being able to go to 3-year funding streams, and I know that other parts of government are looking at 3-year funding streams as well, has been an incredibly welcome step. It's something I pushed for from this committee and the backbenches for a long time in order to do that. And we've had our first 3-year cycle of that from 2017 to 2020 now, and we're evaluating what was the benefits of that, what was the pitfalls of it, because if you've got a 3-year funding cycle with a set amount of money, sometimes there's not enough flex in that as well. So we're looking at how do we enable that as well. But one of the amazing things is that organisations like, you know, Rape Crisis Scotland or Women's Aid, or, you know, some of the other organisations are race all of the organisations who get just having that security that they can project forward for 3 years and actually really work to make that change that they want to see. We all know that cultural change is a generational thing, you know, so more 3-year funding cycles will allow, you know, to really embed that work. And that's the greatest benefit of this, is people feeling secure enough to settle down and have the confidence to move forward for the next 3 years, knowing that they, you know, they're going to have that money coming into their bank accounts in order to deliver the transformational change that we want to see.
And I absolutely agree with everything that you've said. The committee have done a number of external engagements, and we've met a number of different organisations, third sector organisations, and we've had discussions about the funding cycles with them. And while they agree it's good, the move from 1 to 3-year funding cycles, we have heard some concerns that even though it's moved to 3 years, on a yearly basis, they have to almost justify the funding and do a further projection of what they're going to do for the next 2 years. So while in theory they've moved from 1 to 3-year funding cycles, the concerns were raised that in practical terms they are basically doing the same thing on an annual basis. Is that something that you recognise? And is that something that if it is happening that you will remedy?
It's a balance to be had, isn't it, so that we can track that, you know, positive progress is being made, that the money's actually being spent on what organisations told us it would be spent on, and it's making a difference as well. So there's a bit about monitoring and auditing in there that we need to balance with maybe not being so onerous on the reporting mechanisms that they need to engage in. I'll go back and have a look at that. We have been having a look at it now, because across the Equalities portfolio there's about 5 funding streams. I'm trying to consolidate that into something that's much more rational, possibly, you know, two funding streams, and certainly the violence against women funding stream, which will be announced very soon, will give you a recognition of the work that's been done in order to do that. Now, we've not done that in isolation. We've been out and spoke to the same stakeholders that you've had conversations with as well, because we absolutely value their frontline experience in doing this. The last thing we want to do is create burdensome bureaucratic processes, because that costs money as well, and it means it's not being spent on delivering the frontline outcomes that we want to see as well. But certainly we're mindful of it. We've been taking cognizance of it. We've applied some of the learning that we've got from the third sector organisations and the charities that have supported us with their comments. But if there's other work that you think we can do, I'm happy to go back and have a look at that and see how we can make sure that process
it would be helpful if you could have a look at that,
no,
because there was real concerns raised that there is still almost a kind of responsibility to go through the process on an annual basis?
Well, there is an audit, a monitor and audit, which is something about it's public money. We need to make sure it's being spent appropriately. But let's see if we can get that balance a bit better then.
And just finally, when you said that other parts of government are looking at the way they use their funding cycles, can you see in the future all departments in government going to 3-year funding cycles?
I don't know. Because in some cases that might not be appropriate if you've got a quick 1-year project that you want to run, and it's things like that. So it's about having some of that sustainability and confidence and security, but also having a bit of flex and a bit of opportunity. One of the things that we found over the past 3 years is when we've had emerging issues, when all of the budget's committed, and we've had emerging issues that has meant we've had to go back and chat the finance minister's door to say or reprioritise. I have continuously reprioritised for the last 18 months in this portfolio in order to squeeze pennies out in order to respond to something that's flared up, most recently around about race and race relations and post-Brexit and hate crime.
And in relation to public bodies, have you had discussions with public bodies about the way they use funding cycles?
Yeah, some of that conversation has been ongoing as well, because much of the work that we do is about, that partnership working and how can we do that better. I can't speak for COSLA and other organisations like that, but there's certainly a bit of a drive to build more security into the system around about funding. A lot of organisations, as you'll know, will have a varied funding pot that comes from lots of different areas, and some of the national lottery funding is changing and ending right now, so there's pressures on people there as well. So sometimes the pressure on our organisation is not because it's our funding or local government funding, it's maybe another part of their funding basket that they've got that has a pressure on it as well. So we're mindful of all of that, because when it comes to this type of work, we want these organisations to be secure and sustainable and get the outcomes that we want to see as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Angela.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Now, I'm well aware that different ministers have responsibility for different budget lines. But nonetheless, Equalities cuts right across a range of portfolios, and bearing in mind committee doesn't have or hasn't as yet requested attendance by more than one minister. I'm afraid you're the Scottish Government's representative here today, and I know you're the last person that would ever want to operate in a departmental silo as well. But I do want to ask some questions around equalities and human rights vis-à-vis third sector funding. Specifically, it's very welcome that the equalities budget line has increased, and you may want to see more about what you intend to do with your extra money, Minister. But also, is there not a danger that in giving with one hand that we're taking with another, and that may have an impact on the work that you are trying to do, although you may feel that your increase compensates a decrease elsewhere? I don't know. But also picking up on something you said earlier, that in terms of the third sector budget line, that was a very small proportion of overall funding available to the third sector. I wonder if you could say how small that is in comparison to the overall cake that's available, and therefore what's the added value of the third sector fund if it's such a small part of the overall funds that are available.
So I believe that change in that specific funding line is about 1%. So it's tiny compared to what's been spent right across the board.
Sorry, just to clarify that, the percentage of the third sector budget line accounts for 1% of funding that's available to the third sector overall?
No. Yeah. Yes, yes, sorry, yes. And there's a similar percentage point about the change as well. So,
So and the reduction of the third sector fund, is that a 1% cash decrease or a real terms decrease?
I'm going to pass to Emma, because Emma's a person who does all the sort of a detailed money stuff. So if I can ask Emma to just pop in.
Yeah, obviously this sits in Ms Campbell's portfolio, but our understanding is that's a real terms decrease due to one of the funding streams within that pot coming to a natural end. In terms of the details of which funding stream that is, we'd need to get some information from
My
that
question was about
portfolio.
the percentage
Okay.
decrease, whether that, what is a percentage decrease? And, you know, is it, are you talking real terms or cash terms?
Yeah, in cash terms, I think it's a £300,000 decrease in that budget line of almost 25 million. So it is a relatively small decrease, as I say, due to one of the funding streams coming to an end.
Okay, and remind me the increase in Ms McKelvey's budget in cash and real terms is what?
It's just over 21%, which is around about 5.5 million.
Mm-hmm. Okay, right, thank you. And the therefore the added value of the third sector funding line is what, given that it's 1% of the overall cake?
Yeah, I'm not sure I could put a figure on that, but in terms of what that funding line supports, is it supports the infrastructure for the third sector. So things like the TSIs, SCVO, for example, and less about the individual projects and budget lines and that.
Yeah. Okay. And so third sector interfaces are funded. How is it in terms of per population, or is it a kind of standard payment to 32 third sector interfaces?
I'm afraid I couldn't tell you the detail on that, but we can get that and provide that to committee.
We can get it for you, yeah. In terms of some of the evidence that committee heard, we heard a lot about, in particular from smaller organisations, about the you know, quite competitive nature of the funding environment, and how that can sometimes undermine cooperation, and how smaller organisations feel somewhat disadvantaged. So I wondered what is within the Scottish Government's gift to support collaboration and in particular help smaller organisations win more contracts and grants.
So you'll not be surprised that was something that was raised with me probably by everyone who has ever been funded by the Scottish Government, is the competitiveness and sometimes the application process itself, and sometimes the fact that they need to apply to numerous different funding pots to get that. And that's why when I looked at, well, I've got 5, how can we streamline that a bit better, link it much more closely to National Performance Framework outcomes, and then get more money to the front line. And that's why when we realised that ability to create those partnership funding bids, but the ability's always been there, but people didn't really take advantage of it. So some of the work that we are doing now with many of our partners, especially ones that are currently funded and ones who are interested in being funded in the future, is how can we support you in that application process? How can we do some work? So the officials have been out working and gaining all of that information that they need to do that. I think it's very key. Interestingly, in the social isolation and loneliness implementation group, one of the ideas that they came up with was a number of small organisations actually partnering up with a local authority to deliver something in that way, which is pretty unheard of, but actually quite innovative when you look at the pressures that everybody's facing anyway. So that work is being undertaken right now. There's lots of learning out there because lots of people do collaborative funding bids anyway. You know, some of the bigger organisations, is about taking some of that learning and applying it to some of the smaller organisations. So for instance, in social isolation, maybe Age Scotland will have a project, but actually the delivery mechanism of that will be a wee local organisation who does, you know, that particular thing. How do we bring them together rather than being in competition for that fund? How do we bring them together to be partners in accessing that fund? And then
so is there a role here for the third sector interfaces, which are funded via the third sector fund, in terms of that partnership, that collaboration and leveraging in other funding and opportunities, in particular for small organisations, and you know what therefore our Scottish ministers doing to ensure that the funding they're given to third sector interfaces is actually delivering on those opportunities at a local level for smaller organisations.
So you've touched absolutely on the crux of why I can't sit in a silo, because the work that I need to be undertaking with Miss Campbell around about the work in the third sector and the work that she does, she's obviously the budget holder for that bigger pot of money, is that how do we bring additionality, how do we bring much more inclusion in that? And you're absolutely right, third sector interfaces, I've got a great one locally in my area who know all of the organisations, tiny wee one-person organisations up to that. So actually bringing those people together in a much more collaborative fashion, rather than saying, here's a pot of money, you know, everybody all wrestles in there for it. Being a bit more thoughtful about that. And it is, you know, looking at what can be delivered or what needs to be delivered, what, you know, demand have you been experiencing? And actually the only people that can tell us that are those people that are on the front line. And that's why those TSIs and others that do that sort of, you know, networking work for all these organisations are incredibly important in this as well. I'll take back in my conversations with Miss Campbell on how we are doing this now, and maybe put a bit more thought into how we can take more of that forward as well, just in relation to the main point of your question there, given that this is a perfect example of where the influence of the equality team's work across other portfolios can really make a difference and bring that additionality as well. So,
okay,
yeah,
thank you, Minister.
Yeah.
Thanks, Convener.
Minister, you mentioned the National Performance Framework in your opening. I think committee would be interested to hear if you were able to share with us examples when the evidence and information contained in that had caused you to take a different decision in your budget or change things. You know, you spoke about reprioritising.
Have you got an example yourself where you're thinking?
No, that I was hoping to hear one.
It's just this.
I suppose what we're trying to do is make the National Performance Framework, make it real. You know, hear an example of how that information and evidence is used.
So there's lots of ways that we are doing that. We've got a piece of work coming up soon with in the race equality sector. So it's the UN 10 years of recognising people of African descent, and we are just about to look at some projects who are to fund to do some of that work. Now, some of that is about the UN 10 years, but some of it is in the background of some of the flare-ups we've had over the past couple of years around about race and race equality, and about a rise in hate crime in that area. So much of the work in these projects that we're hoping to fund very, very soon is around about how do we raise profile, how do we understand the genesis of racism when it comes to the slave. I don't like calling it the slave trade, and I know that's the normal parlance for it, but you know that the slave economy at the time and the impact that's had on racism now, and especially in the African community. So we're working very, very closely with some of our main partner organisations in that, but that links very, very clearly into the National Performance Framework, where we want a country that is free from discrimination and upholds people's human rights. So, you know, straight away I see the link with the Performance Framework, which is incredibly important to me. It's one pillar. The other pillar is about how do we end that discrimination, how do we make sure that young people and people of African descent who currently live in Scotland have a better life chance and can go about their everyday business. The other piece of work that's a perfect example of how we can apply lots of talk, but time for action is around about the Gypsy Traveller Action Plan and the work that we have done there. I mean, the fact that accommodation was a pivotal issue for Gypsy Traveller people, their employment and welfare outcomes, their health outcomes, education outcomes, you know, their participation in community outcomes cuts across every portfolio in this place. So in the Joint Ministerial Committee, we realised very, very quickly, actually, there's the racism, the institutional racism, the fact that policy does not, you know, Gypsy travellers were invisible in policy, was a perfect example of the work that we can do to change those outcomes for that one community right across the board, but tied very clearly in with the National Performance Framework outcome of, you know, ending discrimination and increasing equality for a particular discrete group of people. Now, I'm incredibly proud of the Gypsy Traveller Action Plan. I will be more proud of it when it starts to, you know, create some of the real changes and outcomes. And Mary's nodding because I know that we share the same ambition, and we're coming up to a 6-month review soon, and I'm looking hopefully to see, you know, a real difference there in that new post that we put in COSLA as well. For me, there is a National Performance Framework outcomes. There's a hard data in that's incredibly important because we can match that process. What I want to see is that Gypsy Traveller community come back to me and saying, there's a difference here, I can see a difference there. That's made a difference to my family and my life. And we have to always think about, you know, the framework in the sense of the human face that's on that. And I want to maybe you to have David Donaldson and Charlotte and others sitting here in front saying, we have seen a difference. And that's incredibly important. Now, the point I make about the Gypsy Traveller Action Plan is that if we can apply that framework for that small part of Scotland's, a very valued part of Scotland's community, how can we scale that up right across the whole of government for all of the other aspects that we have included in the Equalities action that we need to take? So incredibly important. There's loads of examples I can give you, but I know you're short of time.
Thank you. Annie.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Minister.
Morning.
I just wanted to go over the role of advocacy organisations. Third sector advocacy organisations have a role in holding public bodies to account, especially when it comes to achieving better outcomes for groups who have equality needs or require support to access their rights. And I wonder if the Minister could answer whether there's a conflict risks if advocacy organisations are also funded by these same public bodies.
Yeah, there's obviously I've talked a lot about partnership and working with the third sector and working with advocacy organisations and the work that they do as well, and that very important role that they play in scrutinising government and holding us to account too. So I look at many of the advocacy organisations and the work that they do as our critical friends, because they do challenges often, but we also see that part of their role is to do some of the work that we need done in ending inequalities across Scotland as well. So they're a very key partner in that work to do that. So funding them is an incredibly important part of that as well. But I can absolutely tell you that just because they get money from us doesn't mean to say they do what we want them and they say what we want them to say, because they certainly don't. They certainly hold us to very high standard in their scrutiny as well, and rightly so, because the only way we can make progress is to make sure we're always under a sort of a review of what we're doing and what difference does it make, and actually what's the outcome here and is it a positive outcome.
Thanks very much, Convener. Thanks, Minister.
Okay. Any more questions? Okay. I suppose finally, just to ask about the human rights indicator influence over local decisions. Performance in that has fallen since 2007, and it would just be interesting to hear what information the government's collecting to understand why that is.
So again, part of the role that I'm doing is obviously to mainstream right across the whole of government. So another minister has responsibility for that work in local government. And in doing that, it's the Minister for Local Government, Kevin Stewart. I've worked very, very closely with him in a number of areas, you know, around about accessible housing, the Gypsy Traveller Action Plan, issues and how we work very closely with COSLA and local government, you know, violence against women, some of the work around about barring orders and all of that too. So there's a very, very close working relationship there with Kevin Stewart, but when it comes to that indicator, he's actually responsible for it. So one of the things that I want to do is to make sure that I'm not taking responsibility for other ministers' work, in as much as this is what mainstreaming is. You know, there has to be responsibility taken, and one of the pieces of work that we're doing across government is with our leaders forum to ensure that there is leaders in every portfolio who are taking up this piece of work and those indicators as well. So I am sure that I can have Mr Stewart respond to you specifically on the impact that that's had and the changes that are being made there in order to do that.
Okay. Looking at committee, is everyone content? Okay, Minister, thank you very much for joining us this morning. And we now move into private session.